Imagine a place so cold, so remote, and so hostile that for centuries the world largely ignored it. No major cities, no booming economies, no vast populations, just ice. Lots of ice. For most of human history, the Arctic sat at the edge of civilization. A frozen wilderness few people wanted, and even fewer could reach. Yet today, some of the world's most powerful countries are racing to secure influence there. Russia is building military bases. China is investing billions. The United States is increasing its Arctic presence. NATO is paying closer attention than ever before. And the strange part is that this competition is happening in a place most people still consider empty. Why? Because beneath the ice lies one of the most important geopolitical opportunities of the 21st century. And unlike many global rivalries, this one isn't beginning in the future. It has already started. The answer begins with a simple observation. Throughout history, geography has shaped power. And every so often, geography changes. When it does, power often changes with it. That is exactly what may be happening in the Arctic. Even if valuable resources existed beneath the surface, reaching them was often impractical. The region was effectively protected by nature itself. But what happens when that protection begins to disappear? That question is quietly reshaping strategic planning rooms across the world. Because governments are increasingly looking at the Arctic and seeing something very different. Not a frozen barrier, a future opportunity. And one country recognized that opportunity long before most of its competitors: Russia. But Russia is not the only country positioning itself. In fact, one of the most ambitious players in the Arctic isn't even an Arctic nation. It's China, a country with no Arctic coastline whatsoever. And somehow it has become deeply interested in a region thousands of miles from its borders. We'll come back to that. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that uncover the hidden systems behind power, money, geopolitics, and global influence, consider subscribing to Nexplainr. We're building a library of documentaries designed to help you understand the forces shaping the world, both today and in the decades ahead. Now back to the story. While much of the world viewed the Arctic as a distant frontier, Russia viewed it as a strategic asset. Over the past 2 decades, Moscow has expanded military installations across the region, built Arctic infrastructure, modernized ports, expanded its fleet of icebreakers, and strengthened its presence across thousands of miles of Arctic coastline. Russia possesses the longest Arctic coastline on Earth and operates more icebreakers than any other country, giving it a major advantage across the region. In a place where geography creates power, mobility creates leverage. At the time, many observers paid little attention. After all, what was the strategic value of controlling ice? Today, that question looks very different, because the Arctic is no longer just about what exists there. It's about what may become possible there. Most discussions focus on resources, and for good reason. According to estimates from the United States Geological Survey, the Arctic may contain roughly 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and nearly 30% of its undiscovered natural gas. Those numbers are enormous. Entire nations have built wealth, influence, and geopolitical leverage from energy reserves far smaller than that. But resources alone do not explain the growing competition. In fact, they may not even be the most important prize. The real prize could be movement. To understand why, imagine global trade as a network of highways. For centuries, goods traveling between Asia and Europe followed predictable routes. Ships passed through narrow choke points. The Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the Panama Canal. Now imagine a new highway suddenly appearing. A route capable of reducing travel distances between major markets. A route that could save time, fuel, and money. That route is emerging in the Arctic. And history suggests that when trade routes change, power often changes with them. But this is where the story becomes even more interesting, because shipping and resources are only part of the equation. There is another reason governments are paying attention, a reason that receives far less public discussion: military positioning. The shortest distance between major powers often runs across the Arctic, not around it, across it. For decades, the Arctic played an important role in military planning during the Cold War. Today, many strategists believe its importance may be increasing again. Submarines operate beneath Arctic waters. Early warning systems monitor activity across the region. Military infrastructure continues expanding. And as access improves, the strategic value of controlling key Arctic locations may increase as well. In other words, the Arctic is not merely becoming an economic frontier, it is becoming a strategic frontier. And this is where the story becomes more serious, because most people think the race for the Arctic is something that will happen in the future. Many governments believe it has already begun. Military bases are expanding. Trade routes are being planned, infrastructure is being built, territorial claims are being reinforced. The competition is no longer about who discovers the opportunity. It is about who secures the strongest position before everyone else arrives. And that changes the stakes entirely. Because economic competition is one thing, military competition is something else entirely, and this is where China enters the story. At first glance, China's involvement seems strange. China is not an Arctic nation. Its territory lies thousands of miles from the Arctic Circle. Yet Beijing increasingly describes itself as a near-Arctic state. Why? Because modern influence is not limited by geography. China sees opportunities in future trade routes, future resources, future infrastructure, and perhaps most importantly, future leverage. And that may explain why so many governments are investing now, not because the Arctic is already the center of global power, but because they believe it could become one. Despite their different interests, major powers are reaching remarkably similar conclusions. Something valuable is changing. And whenever geography changes, competition follows. That may be the most important lesson in this entire story. Most people think power comes from technology, or money, or military strength. History often suggests something deeper. Power follows access. Access creates trade. Trade creates wealth, and wealth creates influence. For centuries, the Arctic remained protected because access was limited. Now that limitation is beginning to disappear, and the race that follows may help shape the next century. History has seen this pattern before. When new trade routes emerged, power shifted. When Europeans discovered routes around Africa, global commerce changed forever. When the Panama Canal opened, entire shipping networks were reshaped. When oil became the dominant energy source, countries sitting on vast reserves suddenly gained enormous influence. Again and again, seemingly remote regions transformed into centers of global competition, once technology made them accessible. The Arctic may be following the same path. Not because history repeats itself exactly, but because the relationship between geography, access, and power rarely changes. The Arctic is not becoming important because governments suddenly care about ice. It is becoming important because the barriers that once kept everyone out are slowly disappearing. And when new territory becomes accessible, history has a tendency to repeat itself. Competition, influence, power. The Arctic may still look like a frozen wilderness on a map, but to the world's major powers, it increasingly looks like one of the most important strategic regions of the future, because history rarely rewards those who arrive last. And the question is no longer whether the Arctic will matter. The question is, who will control it when it does? If you enjoy documentaries that uncover the hidden systems behind power, money, and influence, subscribe to Nexplainr. And here's the question: will the Arctic become the next great engine of global prosperity, or the next arena of global rivalry?